When I think about misinformation that's going around this Grenfell campaign, and I say the Grenfell campaign, you've got to think there's two sides to it. There's the family survivor side of it, but there's also the state side, the institutions, the governments, the corporations that are involved in profiteering and actually causing this massacre. There's been much misinformation. One of the biggest campaigns that was launched very early in was the buying of property by the Corporation of London for survivors. And so the public had this idea that, oh my God, these survivors are landed on their feet. They've got these real penthouse apartments and they've got nothing to complain about. So it kind of diminished the whole idea about the loss of life, loss of property, because it looked like actually being burnt in your home was actually leading to a windfall. But of course, even if you take out the morality of actually that stupid argument, what we have is a situation where out of over 100 families, only 2 or 3 of them have actually been permanently housed. So again, massive misinformation campaign and led from the top, because Theresa May came out saying that people are going to be rehoused in, I think it was 3 weeks. She's backtracked now and said that they're going to be temporarily, or no, offered housing. So again, more misinformation. The one that's the most troubling at this particular moment in time, though, is the number count. And when I say the number count of people who are victims, people who have died, initially, you had 8, then 15, then 20, and then I think it was was it Lily Allen, who was one of these musicians who made this comment about how they're micromanaging the grief of survivors, micromanaging the nation. So there's been a lot of those are just a couple of examples, but there's been a lot of drip misinformation deliberately trying to kind of kick this into the long curve, recognizing it's not working, so trying different techniques. The resignations was a fantastic piece of PR. So what happened was that the government recognized that the public was baying for blood. They wanted something. So what they did was that they made calls and they made sure that the heads of these councils and of these TMOs stood down, and even though they didn't want to stand down. And that made great drama. I mean, that was better than a soap opera. But what's happened was that most of those people are still on full pay. Most of them, Nick Paget-Brown is still actually a councillor. So nothing's happened to his status, nothing's happened. He set up a consultancy firm. And I'm not a person that likes to point fingers at individuals. I look at them as a collective body looking for individuals on prosecution level. But again, this is mismanagement, this is misinformation, misdirection, and it's very frustrating. I can't talk on the misplacement, on the replacements without having more information. I don't have confidence in the replacements. I just don't, by looking at their performance, but I have to give them a chance to see how it works out. The only way to solve this problem, in my eye, would be to actually get survivors or get people who have been appointed by survivors in those positions. They can work with others who've got the necessary skills to do all the administrative work, but the core leadership and the direction should come from the survivors and families and those who are affected understand it, because let's face it, we've seen nothing but incompetence up to now.
We have to ask ourselves, what kind of people are we, where we are no longer caring about people who live in these communities, which are very strong and resilient communities. We have to ask ourselves why we've allowed, or the governments, the successive governments from Thatcher, to allow us to get into this situation today. There's been all these sort of talks, these sort of hackneyed terms of lessons learned, but will lessons really be learned? Will we be able to look inside ourselves, look inside our consciences and say, we will genuinely put things in place so that there's better social housing for people who cannot afford to buy all the lots of massive housing developments that nobody can afford to live in today? Or are we going to just continue to allow ourselves to be distracted by all other really silly, inconsequential, petty things that we are being distracted by today? So we've got to ask ourselves how we can really genuinely make sure that a situation like Grenfell does not happen. Grenfell was 30 years in the making. And it's very much tied to the crisis in housing that we're experiencing today. We have this situation where the amount of social housing that's available has shrunk enormously. In addition to that, we've got a very little attention being paid to these buildings. Okay, and when they do pay attention to these buildings, they're fixing them, as in the case of Grenfell, to make them look more attractive in an area that is socially elite. I think people are prejudiced to a certain degree towards people who are on low incomes, who may not have a real stake or choose to have a stake in the political process. So those people their voices aren't heard and they tend to be ignored. So I do go back to the point, I do think it's cynicism. I think it is breathtaking cynicism on the part of Kensington and Chelsea, and the way that they tried to cover their tracks in terms of the threats that were made to the people who were raising these alarm bells about what was going on in Grenfell, rather than actually listen to the concerns of the people who lived in that building and in the surrounding buildings. Rather than generally listen to their concerns, they chose to threaten them instead, to silence them. That is really, in my view, quite shocking.
It would be wrong for me to say that survivors have been shut out of the process. This government has recognised that the world is looking at them, and because of that, what they've done is try to operate in a level of pseudo-transparency. So the survivors, families, even local residents are invited into meetings, invited into consultations. But then obviously what they say is just chucked in the bin straight afterwards. But there is this kind of veneer of inclusiveness. I think we've got to understand that that's actually part of the PR campaign, and it's not actually leading to any positive change, or else the families would have been housed by now.
I mean, nobody could anticipate that this would come to this, but at the very least there would be some structures in place to be able to assist people in this type of situation. And in my view, it's another reminder that perhaps you can't rely on the government. You can't rely on local government or national government to help you in true times of crisis.
When I'm asked about the media's role in this and whether it's covering up the situation, if it's pushing the idea that everything's been solved, I have to pull back a little bit. Even though we are called Grenfell MediaWatch, we're not a propaganda arm. I mean, perhaps we are. We're propaganda for the community, for survivors, but not in the sense of trying to mislead. And one thing we've got to be honest about is that the media is actually divided on this now. Initially, I would argue that it was all sensationalism. It was just kind of trying to put bums on seats, sell more newspapers, get more coverage, and just people getting bigger audience share. But right now, something's happened, and we sense that as a team. There are some organisations, independent organisations like yourself, that are coming out and actually are really sincere about getting justice. And this isn't just about getting more viewers or getting more readers or listeners. There are some mainstream organisations. Jon Snow's discussion at the annual conference was another one. Channel 4, who sometimes a little bit naughty in their reporting, they have been quite fearless on this. Even the BBC, unfortunately, are earning a reputation as the state's broadcaster. I hate having to say that, but they're being pretty poor on their approach and making documentaries as such. I think that they're crossing a very thin line of actually trying to whitewash this. Some mainstream media is actually painting the story on the side of the government because they're worried maybe because they're not going to get their funding or for commercial or political interests, while other media, I think we've picked up, we've talked about this, that it's pricking the conscience of some journalists, some editors, but we are in the minority. Let's be clear about that. That the Daily Mails of this world, the LBCs of this world, the Foxes, the Skies, they are still leading the charge, and they have the largest audiences, so hence they are the most influential in actually turning the public against supporting Grenfell families. When I'm asked how do I feel about the inquiry now that we've had the opening, quite strangely, I'm actually quite pleased, because I think that what Morbick has done is actually been upfront. He's made it very clear that he's not looking for any criminal prosecutions. He's made it very clear that he's going to ask the suspects for the evidence. He's made it clear that his agenda isn't justice in the sense of how we would see justice. It's pretty much about a collaborative, I think he used the word cooperative, pursuit for truth amongst those who are responsible for one of the worst atrocities on mainland England. So, it's quite refreshing actually that we know going in that it's not going to deliver the results. So it lowers the expectations of most of the people. So when it's published and we see and we hear those famous lines, lessons will be learned and lessons have to be learned, and we have a recommendation list which is 100 strong, which means absolutely nothing. We knew this going in. I just worry about the waste of time, and I worry about those people who don't have access to maybe, I don't want to say competent political media, but more grassroots political media, who may actually be sucked in by all the fancy words, the media coverage, and actually might think that the inquiry is actually an important instrument. For me, the inquiry actually obstructs the police investigation, and I don't actually have much confidence in the police investigation, but I have more so in that than I have in the inquiry. And the fact that the inquiry actually defers key decisions being made, that's a problem for me. I think there is a deliberate decision by government to make sure that the inquiry takes precedence over everything, just simply because they don't want themselves to be implicated in some of the decisions that are made, because they are implicated in some of the housing bills that are made, the deregulation that took place. But also, I think they also recognise that when you have an inquiry of this nature, of this size, it serves as a kind of pseudo-truth and reconciliation exercise. What happens is that you feed people sound bites, their emotions dissipate over time, and then after a year or two, you release an interim report here or there. At least 90% of Morbig's team are ex-government officials. They've either worked in the Treasury or worked in one department, they're civil servants. I mean, there's no one whatsoever from the community working at that level. And this claim about impartiality is complete and utter nonsense. Or whilst all the universities across the UK should be disbanded, because obviously the knowledge that they're producing is worthless because people know each other. I mean, how could we have impartiality in modern research? So, I mean, come on, let's be real.
The questions you should be asking of politicians and powerful people, I want to say, how can you sleep in your beds at night? But I mean, if these individuals are truly appalled and shocked by what has happened, what do they really plan to do to alleviate the problems, the challenges that the victims and the families of Grenfell currently face? Okay, they're saying a lot of things. For example, they talked about rehousing people in 3 weeks or finding them accommodation. That hasn't materialised. So what steps do they plan to take as a consequence of this tragedy from a human perspective, not from a political perspective? I think that in times like this, I think, yes, it is very political, but sometimes you've got to be human. What would you do if these were people you knew? If you knew these people, and what they're currently facing and experiencing, and how are you generally going to help them to help to rebuild their lives? To me, justice would look like the people responsible for the Grenfell tragedy facing criminal prosecution and going to prison. That's what justice would look like to me. Justice would look like a recognition, a true recognition of the failings of the local government and the national government in terms of making these decisions not to have adequate health and safety procedures in place, and to be honest about the true number of people who have lost their lives. Okay, because I think there's a problem there when you don't say how many people, the true number, because there's now there all kinds of assumptions will come out of that number. This is a true tragedy. People have died in the most horrific way possible, and I think we need to keep the people in the people's centre, should be centred in this. It's their story, it's their experience, and we should be sympathetic and empathetic of that experience.
If people are interested in Grenfell MediaWatch, they can just go to our Facebook page, log on, share. I think the biggest thing that we need is people, if you like what you see on there, share it. If you hear news or even if you disagree, say something. I think the biggest thing we need is debate, comments. We need the topic kept alive. And that comes from us exploring ideas, critiquing ourselves. We're not always right. What happens is something that's in our head. What happens when we make a mistake? Is everyone going to turn on us? Or are they going to recognise that we're humans and we're doing it with the right intentions? Get involved in this debate. Get involved in this topic. Don't let it become a Hillsborough. Don't let it become something that's like a folk legend that everyone says, oh, no, let's deal with it right this time.